Boy, when we look at the world and we see the massive amount of suffering in the world, and we also look in our own lives and we see the suffering that we endure at different times, it is tempting to think that God doesn't care about suffering.
Tempting? I think you mean logical. Let's do this. Greetings, fellow space travelers. BionicDance here. It's been a while since the problem of evil came up, and Greggy Poo has a thing or two to say about it. Things that don't particularly make sense. Self-contradictory, really.
We know, as we look back on our lives, that sometimes the suffering that we experience produced some of the greatest growth that we've ever experienced.
And yet, it was still suffering. An all-loving God would prevent all of it, not just give us tools to conquer the shit that's coming up. And an all-knowing God would see this crap coming. An all-powerful God could do something about it. And again, an all-loving God would want to. The fact is that Christians made their God too damned powerful to match the world we live in. To have their God and this world be compatible, he's got to have at least a few flaws. But no, they had to play my God has a bigger dick than your God with the other religions in the world, and ended up shooting themselves in the foot by it.
And as parents, we know that we have to put our children through what they consider a lot of unnecessary suffering to raise them up in the right way and teach them how to live and help them to be able to deal with the world as it really is.
The world that God allegedly made like that. Papa all-loving gave us a shitty world and then puts us through crap in order to cope with what he set up. Everybody following this logic? Yeah, me neither.
Listen, change happens in our life, but I realize, and maybe you do too, that change usually doesn't happen unless it's more painful to stay the same than it is to change. And that usually only happens when suffering comes into our life and forces us to move forward, okay?
And I even agree with that. But it's not the issue. We're trying to find out how an all-loving God can also allow suffering. And what we have here is a prevarication that ignores a few inconvenient facts about their claim regarding God's nature. Suffering needn't exist at all. But it does. And that makes the triple omni of God's alleged character invalid.
So we can see how love and suffering can be compatible in the micro, but what about the macro?
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Let's not be too hasty to move on here, because his claim that suffering exists to make us grow doesn't necessarily follow. There are people who suffer their entire lives, never have that chance for happiness. Maybe they're born with a fatal disease or a birth defect that causes them constant misery. Maybe they live in a war-ravaged country, never having enough food, maybe roughed up and killed by soldiers. Where's the growth? Where's the chance for peace and happiness, the end to suffering? It's really easy for a healthy white guy in a first world nation to claim that suffering ends, leading us to become better people. But it's also naive and short-sighted.
Look at all the suffering that's in the world. Well, we understand a little bit about why that's the case. Because of a rebellion that took place a long time ago and created a mess in the world. That's the problem of evil.
No, that's not the problem of evil, you ignorant dumbass. The problem of evil is what I brought up before about God being all-knowing, loving, and powerful, yet allowing evil into the world in the first place. It's not about the source of evil, and don't get me started on why you think it happened. It's about God's refusal to eliminate it. That is the problem of evil.
Does God care about that? Let me tell you how much God cared about that. God cared about the suffering in the world so much that he stepped down out of heaven, that he got low, that he got small, that he became one of us. Can you imagine what that's like?
I said to not get me started. And the whole sacrifice on the cross malarkey was not about ending suffering on earth. It was about giving people access to heaven by making a way to absolve them of sin, especially so-called original sin. It's an idiotic solution to a problem that God created in the first place. But that's how the story was written. Seriously, how do I know more about your religion than you do? This is just sad.
Does God care about suffering in the macro? Yes, that's why he came down. That's why he became a man. He entered into the suffering himself, so one day, ultimately, the whole world could be rescued from suffering.
But he's not rescuing the world. And it's not being done in a way we can see, in a way that is definitely happening for real. Hell, we're not even given the opportunity to know that he is real in the first place. So, to sum up, The world is a shitty place and our lives are shitty because an all-loving God made them that way and then told us it was our fault, allegedly to make us grow to cope with the crappy game of The Sims he's playing with us. But it's okay because he sacrificed himself to save us from the sin he created, and so we'll eventually be going to a place without suffering that we never get to know exists, and the admission price is belief without evidence and strict obedience to his book, which has hundreds upon hundreds of interpretations produced by as many denominations, all of which tell us we're doomed if we don't conform to them and not to others. Okay, sounds legit. Anyway, before I go, amusing side note. Last night, I finally hit 20,000 subscribers, then lost 2 while I slept, then got 'em back later this morning. Good times. And speaking of times, until the next one, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please, think.